tell us a bit more about Josephine Butler? Who was she? What was her background?
Josephine Butler was born into a relatively wealthy family, and she married a clergyman, and through that marriage and through her own personal bereavement, the loss of her youngest child, she threw herself into a really extraordinary social campaign. And the reason why I think I want to emphasise Butler's importance is because the work she did, on the one hand, sits really in parallel or doesn't seem that related to the question of women's suffrage. But I think the question of women's involvement in politics more generally and what right women have to be represented across a whole society. So Butler's major campaign, for what she's remembered, not as strongly as she should be remembered really, is the campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts.
What exactly was the Contagious Diseases Act, and why was Butler objecting to it?
The Contagious Diseases Act was a series of legislative interventions aimed at controlling the spread of venereal disease, of sexually transmitted diseases, basically in the army and the military. So it reminds us of several things. One is that this is in the 1860s when this legislation comes in. It's really at the heart, the engine moment of the growth of the British Empire. And among the government administration, there's real concern that the military forces are being debilitated by the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So what do we do about this? We need our strong army to suppress the empire. How can we control what sailors and soldiers get up to when they are on leave? And the first response to this was to look at the bodies of women in port and garrison towns. So Portsmouth, Colchester, the key cities where soldiers and sailors would have their leave. And it basically was a series of controls imposed on working class women's bodies in those towns. The Contagious Diseases Acts gave a huge amount of leeway to government officers, to health officers, to stop women on suspicion of being a prostitute, to subject them to a forcible examination by speculum, which Butler termed a kind of instrumental rape, and to keep them, there's no real treatment for venereal disease in this period, to keep them in what were called lock hospitals, under lock and key, depriving them of freedom, basic freedoms, until they were perceived to be clear of signs of venereal disease. So Butler's choice of a campaign to involve herself in is really radical, because she was taking up the cause of women who were perceived to be completely out of the realms of society, let alone polite society in the time. Women prostitutes, women suspected of being involved in the sex trade, sex work, were treated as the scum of society in this period. They were fallen women. They'd gone out of that alleged, separate sphere of the private realm. They'd sold their bodies for money. And wherever you look in 19th century art and literature, once you lose your reputation, once you are fallen sexually, that's it, you're done for. The end is practically suicide and death. It's a very grim picture. But Butler tried to work to change that story. She argued strongly that women, working class women, whether prostitutes or not, had rights to their own body, that to keep them interned in hospitals without trial was beyond the pale, that this sense that you could be subjected to this examination and this lockup on suspicion of being a prostitute, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time or dressed in the wrong way, was an absolute, she felt, was an absolute contravention of basic liberal rights of the human being and the human body. So really, her campaigns were very active during the 1870s against this set of legislation. And it was unheard of, really, for a respectable middle-class woman, the wife of an Anglican clergyman and a very high-achieving Anglican clergyman, to stand up in a platform in public and talk about sex and prostitution, and to say, why is it women's bodies that are subject to control? Why is there no attempt to control the men who are themselves the ones seeking out this sexual contact in, when they're on leave, on shore leave? And she was absolutely vilified for it. She had excrement thrown at her. There were huge pamphlet wars against what she was doing, but she felt desperately impelled by her Christian beliefs to say that these women were full humans and should have full human rights. They were not just vessels or bodies, they were people, they were political subjects. And that's a campaign she kept going through her life. In fact, in the latter part of her life, even when she'd achieved the repeal of these acts in Britain by the mid-1860s, these similar sorts of legislation were starting to be enforced in the empire, in India in particular. And so campaigners took up her work over there. So she was very involved in a whole range of campaigns that made the question of women's sexuality and women's sexual availability and the sex trade part of political debate.